Hi, this is Keren Cirillo, and I'm a Lowell City Councilor, and I'm here this evening with a wonderful group of 4 panelists, and we're here to have a panel discussion on climate change. And what we're going to be speaking about today is the IPCC Special Report on Global Warming 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so I would love for the panel to introduce themselves. Let's start with.
I'm Matt Barlow. I'm a professor of climate science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell.
And I'm Juliette Rooney-Varga. I am a professor in environmental science and director of the Climate Change Initiative at the University of Massachusetts in Lowell.
I'm John Wooding, now a professor emeritus of political science at UMass Lowell and part of the Climate Change Initiative Steering Committee.
And I'm Rusty Russell. I'm executive director of the Merrimack River Watershed Council.
Okay, so there are some core concepts to this environmental study that was produced on October 8th of 2018, and they are global mean surface temperature, pre-industrial, global warming, net zero CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide removal, total carbon budget, remaining carbon budget, temperature overshoot, emission pathways, impacts, risk, and climate resilient development pathways. Would you like to speak about the report?
Sure. You bring out some really important words that are used to describe the situation, and we can dive into those if you'd like.
Yes.
I think just to kind of zoom out, IPCC stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body of scientists that is an international group of scientists. Actually, Matt is a contributing author or a lead author now of the next upcoming report. And basically, so maybe you can speak to it better than I can, but the report that you're referring to is basically a review of a little more than 6,000 scientific studies that have been published. So they've been published in the peer-reviewed literature, which means that other scientists have reviewed them and considered them to be sound. And the report was written by, as far as I know, 90 or so researchers actively publishing climate scientists and those in related fields that are relevant for this report. It reflects basically the consensus view of those researchers. So I would say it's a conservative document in terms of only representing the things that those scientists, so that have already been published. It's not the cutting edge, it's sort of like what's already gotten through. And then also what those scientists can agree on. And also governments have an opportunity to sign off on those documents. So our government and others have signed off on that. It's basically a body that is connected to the United Nations. As far as the report itself, I think where I think of it from is really initially this report was commissioned as a result of the Paris Agreement. So many people are familiar with that, but maybe not everybody. In 2015, it was the last time that heads of state came together along with many negotiators and delegates in Paris to try to come up with a global agreement to prevent the worst outcomes of climate change and to create a better future for our kids and ourselves. And out of that agreement, out of that negotiation, came basically a voluntary, so it's non-binding, but it's an agreement where nations who are party to that, and there are actually 196 nations that have agreed, that are part of the Paris Accord, agreed to limit global warming, or the rise in global average temperature, to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, and that's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, that's the average global temperature, by 2100, and actually to do as much as possible to reach 1.5, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that report then, the question really at the time was that this 2 degrees C goal was seen as adequate for many nations, but then there were many others that were saying, no, we're actually going to be, low-lying ocean states, many African nations, many others in tropical areas would actually be risking their very survival and existence at that 2 degrees C mark. And so there was this question of sort of what is the difference between 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C in terms of outcomes, and what would it take to get to that 1.5 degrees C outcome. And that's, I should say also, a 2 degree C rise compared to pre-industrial levels, so 1850 or so.
Right.
So far, we've already had a 1 degree C rise, so 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're already like kind of at least half, if not more than half of the way there in terms of that rise. I don't know, do you want to add anything?
I think the only other piece of context I would add is a 1.5 degrees Celsius, or maybe 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, doesn't sound like anything on a weather basis. But in terms of globally average surface temperature, just for context, the peak of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago was only about 4.5 degrees colder in Celsius. So 1.5 degrees Celsius is about 1/3 of the way between an ice age and now. So about 1/3 of the way between a mile of ice over us here in eastern Mass, more or less, and our current temperature. So on a daily weather basis, you would say 1.5 degrees, who cares? But on a globally average surface temperature, it's a huge change in the climate. And that's why people are so concerned, and that's why the global impacts are so severe, because again, it sounds small, but it actually on a global level, those are huge, drastic changes in the climate system.
Yeah, and to add to what Matt's saying, going and you can correct me if I've got the numbers slightly off, but I think in this point in time, if you're talking about 2 degrees Celsius, you'd be talking on the order of eventually getting to the order of tens of meters of sea level rise. So we're not expecting that to happen anytime soon, but as the climate equilibrates to that new level, or all of Earth's systems equilibrate to that new level over the course of, sort of the worst case scenario right now, if we keep on emitting at a very high level and we don't have that 2 degree C outcome, is that we could see as much as 8 feet of sea level rise in the Northeast by 2100. That's sort of the worst case scenario. But over time, we expect that to continue to rise, especially if so limiting it to 1.5 would be a much better outcome and a slower change. And if we don't do that, then we expect to see those rapid changes.
Right. John, do you have anything to say?
Other than I find this report, the report and the knowledge about what we're doing here, to be quite depressing, because I think the future is the potential catastrophic nature of this. And I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm a political scientist. And really, the reason nothing much has been going on is because of the political context in which this is happening. I mean, clearly, the failure in many countries to do more, even when we knew about this problem decades ago, has been it's a political issue, not a technical issue. The technical solutions were there and available, but the political will and the political powers involved, I think, create a real problem for both having in the past dealt with the issue and going forward in the future. Unless we, to quote a phrase, change our way of thinking, the potential for the loss of habitat, the loss of life, increasingly violent storms, and the political conflicts that will come out of that could be as catastrophic as the climate change itself.
Well, I'm sort of a localist, so I'm sort of the odd person out in this panel. I'm not going to talk.
I am also. I'm a localist.
That's true. That's true. City Council, River. But I do want to say that there are some consequences we think we're beginning to see right here in Lowell, in the form of more abrupt, stronger, longer rainstorms that are doing something that is particular to Lowell and a couple of other old urban environments on the Merrimack and elsewhere, which is causing sewage releases from sewage treatment plants, known as combined sewer overflows. And we're very concerned about that. We're seeing an uptick this year, along with not just increase in rain of about, I think, 14% or so. The average is at 47 inches a year, but also an increase in sudden rainstorms, and that really triggers the so-called combined sewer overflows. And we can go into detail later, but I just wanted to say that this is happening on the ground here, and flooding has also been a problem on the river in various places like Lawrence, where our office is. I like to think of climate change, or I like to call it climate destabilization, not climate change. As I told a reporter once, Americans love change, and he laughed because they do, and it sounds great. Destabilization is what we're looking for, and that's what I think I'm hearing the other panelists say. John here said we're looking at political disruption ultimately, and massive changes in our use of private property, and that's going to be very destabilizing. But I'll come back to the local level and talk about sewage in a moment.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. So
Can I make a couple of connections that I just heard you all say? So one thing that I would just say is that, to reiterate what John said, the IPCC report stated clearly, as you said, that this is physically and technically possible to achieve. We have the science, we have the technology, and not only that, but the economic analysis indicates that we would actually accumulate $20 trillion in additional wealth if we met this 1.5 degree C goal. So I just want to, like, the positive news is that it is possible as far as we understand the science today. Of course, there are some uncertainties, and I would say so far the science has been, like, the outcomes have been worse and have come sooner than we thought, and that's one of the things of this report is that it's indicated that things are a little bit worse than we thought. But from what we know today, it's technically possible, it's physically possible. As John said, it's a political question. Do we have the will to do this? And then, as you say, you're a localist, and I would say that that's great. And that's exactly what we need, right? We need to be, you know, like the common phrase, like, think globally, act locally. It's like, yes, we're sort of tired of hearing that, but what we need to be doing is looking at a global scale. Okay, globally, what do emissions need to do? And locally, how do we achieve that? And so I think that we're all localists, and we also all need to be thinking about the fact that we live on one planet.
If I could just add to both of those points really quickly, I mean, on the optimistic side, we have a model, two models for success at least. One in the U.S. would be the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts, and going back to local rivers, it's absolutely incredible the difference in our waterways from 30, 40, 50 years ago. Boston Harbor is a great example, but I was telling my son the other day that in the 60s, rivers actually used to literally catch on fire in the U.S.
Yes.
And that's very dramatically different. And the Merrimack itself is much cleaner, a much healthier river. Not still without its struggles, but
it's not fishable or swimmable, but at least it's not flammable.
Right. So, which is a low bar. It's a low bar, I'll grant you, and you know, we hope to see more. But so on the national level, we certainly have in the past shown the capacity to see these problems and act on them, and at least significantly correct them. And at the international level, there was the ozone hole was an international issue that came up, and the global community was able to recognize it as a serious threat and actually do something about it. And there have been twists and turns in that story even in the last year, but overall there's been global action. So I sort of agree, John, with your sentiments, but I try to remind myself that actually we do. It's a hard road to hoe, but we do have some positive examples where, as Juliette said, we can do these things.
Indeed, I mean, the only thing I would say is, philosophically speaking, I call it the global versus the local. There's a sort of chronological version of that between the short term and the long term. I mean, what Matt was saying, yes, in 1970 we created the EPA, we had great government regulations. I mean, you know, I need to go and remember and I'm old, so I remember what the cities were like to breathe in before the EPA and before these regulations occurred. And the ozone question is another good one, because in fact, the change in the use of the chemicals that were causing the ozone to deteriorate were actually profitable to industry. But you know, the economic system we live in is not very good about making investments now for the long term, which is what we need to do for the long-term future of our children, given the potential catastrophe we're facing. And so you've got to do that kind of thinking we did in 1970, you've got to do that now. And we have to convince people that acts now will in fact be profitable, as well as saving the world from the disaster it's facing.
Right. When I ran for city council, one of the reasons why was because I saw all these great protections being cut, and I said, well, everything starts at home. It starts at home. So I started watching, going to the city council meetings, and there was really not much talk about the environment and helping keep Lowell sustainable. So, and that's very important to me. And so that was one of the reasons that made me run for city council, because I believe that everything starts at home. And I continue to believe that today. And in my efforts, in my environmental efforts through the city, in trying to move the city forward, because even though it's a small effort for the city of Lowell, it does have an impact.
Absolutely.
And it's helping. You know, I look at it and I say, I'm trying to help Lowell for future generations. It might not happen in my generation, but for future generations, this is important.
And I want to come back to that too, because I think that there are this sort of question about, you know, because of inertia in the climate system, because it takes a long time for you know, reducing emissions to play out in terms of its impacts on the climate, which is something that, you know, you're referring to this long-term effect. But despite that longer-term effect, the reality is that there are many things that we can do today that both lead to a better climate outcome for our children or down the road, but also lead to better outcomes for us immediately.
Yes.
And so, you know, there's so many examples, but like one that I would encourage us to be looking for those, because waiting for long-term benefits is not always the best way to get things done. And actually, as you're saying, you know, we need to have change now. Like, you need to have something, you know, with the river, right? Like, we need to be addressing problems that are occurring right now. So some examples I would just put out there are, like, you know, you're talking about biking initiatives earlier.
Yes,
and
it's been a big one for me.
Right. And so that would be one example where you could be addressing reducing emissions, which will have long-term climate benefits, but at the same time addressing the epidemic of obesity.
Exactly.
Of improving social connection amongst people in the city and civic engagement. And getting, you know, people getting their exercise. So those are ways that you can have immediate benefits for the population today, while still, and I think that it's important that we sort of look for all of those opportunities, you know, like that we look for a way to purposefully be addressing the current problems along with climate change long-term problems at the same time.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, another example of that is the concern about transportation. I mean, nobody likes being in traffic jams. We all complain about parking. Well, if we had better public transportation and better pavements and better ways of walking, this would contribute to it, and that would also deal with some of the issues facing with climate change. I think Juliette's absolutely right, and every moment you do that is a moment for education, you know, around this issue. So you can make it both immediate and long-term, personal and global at the same time. And I think we need to think about ways to do that are interesting and innovative.
Although I think that we do need to face the fact that we're living in a political moment here where these very noble thoughts are not getting the emphasis they deserve. And I've been in the environmental field for many years, as I'm sure many of you have. And these are the same arguments we made back in 1990. So one of the questions I have is, how are things different now that aren't worse, and how do we act? And one of the arguments you can make is we really, in this moment, acting locally is even more important than it was, you know, 20 years ago. So specifically, what are some of the things? And Juliette has mentioned some of them, and we can, I'm sure, come up with some more. And then the question becomes, if I'm a citizen of Lowell and I want to get involved, you know, what do I want to get involved in? Where do I invest my time and my energy?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, yes.
Well, I don't know if this is specific to Lowell so exactly, but renewable energy is much cheaper than it used to be. So I think a lot of the economic wins are clearer now than they were even 10 years ago. And I think the fact that whichever communities invest effort and time in this and make these changes will benefit immediately and in the short term as well. So I think that the more efforts you make as a community, the more you become a leader. And being a community in Massachusetts, I think is it's a good place to be in terms of wanting to do more renewables, wanting to do more bike lanes, being a little more mindful about water use and all those things. But sort of turn it back in terms of the river, what's your wish list for Lowell residents?
Oh gosh, well, my wish list right now has mostly to do with sewage. So I hope none of you have had dinner. My wish list actually involves a problem that dates back to a brilliant engineering idea that started in the 19th century, and that was to combine so-called sanitary sewage sewer lines with stormwater sewer lines. And sanitary sewer lines, of course, are very unsanitary. That's what comes out of your bathroom. And stormwater comes from rain and falls on pavement and becomes polluted to some extent. When those two lines are put together, as they are in our older industrial cities in the area, essentially sewage plants can't handle the flow when we have a rainstorm, in some cases not a very large rainstorm, and as a result, if the sewage would either back up into people's homes, which is a non-starter, especially if you're on city council, or it would inundate the plant, in which case you'd have a multi-million-dollar repair bill. So the third way is to dump it into the river, and that's what happens in 6 communities on the Merrimack River or tributaries, including Lowell. And I don't want to, I think the folks who work at the Lowell sewage treatment plant are friends, and I think they're doing a great job, but they have a very big job ahead because they dump themselves. I think so far this year, they're up to 200 million gallons of raw sewage. And they're the 2nd largest polluter on the river, the first being the sewage treatment plant in Manchester, which dumps about 350 million gallons, but they don't actually tell you. So those are real consequences of a changing climate, and we can see them, we can measure them, and we can be affected by them. And it's too bad because the Merrimack is really one of the premier resources of the area, and it really could be fishable and swimmable much of the time if we could get through this issue. But it's expensive. So
yes, it is.
Folks can press to have essentially the engineering problem fixed. It is not something that can be done in a year or two, but up to now it's been kind of ignored, and we're finding that the plans to fix the problem are well behind schedule in a number of cases. So,
and I think one of the things that you're bringing up that's really important, no matter what kind of infrastructure we're talking about, like whether it's the natural gas pipelines or the sewage system, is that most of the regulations, codes, even training that engineers go through is based on statistics from a static past. The problem is the past is no longer a good guide for the future. So we have a situation where we have science, like we have very good, robust scientific research, and we're privileged to have that. We're really privileged to live in an age where we have this window, this robust window into this sort of, what are the possible futures we're gonna face? And I think that if we don't leverage that, so we need to be looking to, not to the past, but rather to scientific projections for the future to understand what we should be doing. But also, when we have a problem with our infrastructure, or when we have a, like this, what happened with the natural gas explosions that recently occurred. So, or if you have a storm that wipes out some roads, bridges, whatever, we need to be thinking about what is the future that we want, right? Not just sort of, our tendency is to immediately rebuild what we had before. But does rebuilding, let's say in the case of the natural gas pipelines, does putting in a tremendous amount of resources into digging up all these roads, fixing all these pipes, and then again fueling explosives into people's homes, when natural gas is one of the things that's causing climate change. So instead, or in the case of the sewage, like every time we're rebuilding a road or have an opportunity to make a change that's not going to be so expensive to make, we need to be thinking about not just recreating what we had in the past, but knowing what are the projections for future potential floods. How can we reduce the impervious surface that we have and reduce runoff?
Right, that's a really important point. I guess I'm skeptical that at this late date, green infrastructure, that is things like rain gardens, can totally address the problem, but you're absolutely right. We don't favor like a totally engineered solution. If you can use green design to create places where water will naturally soak back into the soil, there are 10 or 15 different chemical processes that clean water, and clean out pollution and heavy metals that naturally happen if it doesn't run off rapidly on roads and into storm drains, whether or not you have a combined sewer system. And that's where a lot more attention. For example, the city of Cambridge has a combined sewer problem itself, but they just created a huge green infrastructure project where stormwater essentially runs into a series of lagoons and is cleaned that way. That whole area is now a beautiful public park, but it is also a far cheaper way of dealing with polluted stormwater than using the heavy engineering techniques of separating a sewer system. So completely agree, and we need to start focusing on that.
But I think both of those things are a good example of the political problem you face with this, because you just said you need both of things require investment. I don't know anybody who wants their house to blow up because the gas pipes are old, or they want sewage coming on their bathroom, right? But convincing the voter, not so very much the city leaders, that this requires a contribution, and that contribution is probably higher taxation to make these things happen, so the future is saved. And what you find, because I didn't grow up in this country, but certainly from the European perspective, where people in general are more willing to pay taxes to build the kinds of infrastructure they think government should be responsible for. That's a long history in this country, that not happening. And so there's an educational process, even before we get to convincing our leaders in city council we should do this, because no city councillor is going to get elected simply by saying, I want to raise your taxes, right? I mean, that's probably not a good start.
Even necessarily, I mean, there's also the question of agency, right? And who is making the money?
Right.
So, I mean, I think, right now, the status quo is that fossil fuels are, so coal, oil, and natural gas are concentrating wealth and political power. So literal power in terms of the power that we use every day, like our electricity or, gas, whatever. But then also like political and monetary power. And I think that that's something that needs to change. It's not going to be easy to change, but it's not clear to me that it doesn't necessarily means higher taxes for people. It means policy for sure. And it means finding creative ways to, to not allow the status quo to continue and and allow that concentrating of wealth and power to continue.
Right. I think it has to do with reactive versus proactive. When we're reactive, we're just doing the status quo. But when we're proactive, we're going beyond that. And I think that it needs to have a sort of like a thoughtful change in your process as far as actually about thinking about things, thinking about climate change.